The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
Hey, welcome to the program. Good to have you along with us on this Sunday morning here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, or now I believe it's maybe replayed as well, too, so it's another time of day. But thanks for joining us here on the program. I'm Ben Ball, along with the Reverend Carl Zarowski from St. Peter's United Methodist Church, Reverend Robert Cornegie from Chaplin by the Sea in Emerald Isle, and retired Anglican Bishop Doc Loomis with us. And good day, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Hey.
Hope everyone is well today. All right, as we get rolling here today, let's talk about a couple of the articles that have been out for the last couple of weeks or so. This one comes from, it's a series of articles or series of columns that's presented by the University of Texas called The Conversation, Academic Rigor, Journalistic Flair. That's the subtitle for this column. And this particular one is written by Denise Spellberg, and she is the author of a book about Islam and writes about it here in this column. It's called Why Jefferson's Vision of American Islam Matters Today. And she starts out with just the opening paragraph. An estimated 3.3 million American Muslims are celebrating the month of Ramadan. It was during this month that the Prophet Muhammad first received revelations from God. The holiday has been celebrated at the White House with American Muslims since 1996. Also mentions it's been celebrated at the State Department since 1999. Neither one of those celebrations are taking place this year. And so she goes on to describe about Muslims in North America since as early as the 17th century by talking about her book called Thomas Jefferson's Quran, Islam, and the Founders. It says that 15 to 30% of enslaved West African population of British America were Muslims, and that many of those, again, slaves that came to this country were of that faith. And as a 22-year-old law student in Williamsburg, Virginia, Jefferson bought a Koran 11 years before drafting the Declaration of Independence. I think I've been to that bookstore. I think it was still there. But the idea of Muslims in this country is nothing new. I mean, we certainly have known, and it's been recorded. But this, she goes on to make the claim that Jefferson was particularly sensitive to Muslims and people of other religions in this new understanding of what an American experiment would be. Robert, did you find anything in this article, one that you didn't already know, or that was enlightening?
No.
That's kind of the answer I expected, actually.
Okay, next question.
Next segment.
Let me elaborate on my no. Well, no, this is a topic, I think I'm a history buff, and particularly American history buff, and particularly the Revolution period and all that led up to it and what happened after it. So I've done a fair amount of reading on this, and particularly in the context of that whole slave trade issue, because having worked in Africa and in Europe, the other part of the triangle of terror, they call it, from the Americas to Europe to Africa, it was a important part of when we would talk to folks in Africa about what was going on, what such a huge percentage of their population was taken away from the continent and had a major influence on the development of that country. So yeah, this is stuff. I mean, I've read this stuff before. I haven't read her book, but I think she, when she talks about that 15 to 30% of the slaves were of Islam, well, that leaves a pretty large percentage that were either already Christian or were animist of other traditions. And so, but I think this is something one thing we have to keep clear is that there were a handful of leaders of the revolution, a handful, that were deists at that time. And Jefferson was one of them. So
What's that distinction?
Well, a deist believes that there is a God, but not necessarily that Jesus Christ is of the Trinity, of the Godhead. So a deist believes that a God exists. So it can be Allah, it can, and he talks about it, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and everyone else. So he's kind of in that worldview. He had moved to that worldview. And but his formation was in Christianity, and then he sort of stepped aside somewhat. But he believed in the existence of God. So he wouldn't have any problem with including in his penumbrum of rights all these other faiths, rather than just limiting it to what you often hear, denominations, Christian denominations. It was really where a lot of the discussion took place. So you got to be a little careful to not conflate denominationalism with
Pluralism.
Yeah, pluralism. Exactly. Thank you, Carl.
Right. Besides Robert getting the William F. Buckley Award for linguistic gymnastics.
It's the Penundrum Conundrum.
Yes. Doc, I think one of the things that this author conveniently overlooks is that often I would think a number of the slaves were of a particular religion only because they were conquered in that vein. I don't know that for a fact, but I think that was how Islam moved across that part of the world. So I don't know if that for a fact, but does it matter? The article again is talking really about the American pluralistic society.
Yeah, when the Muslims conquer you, it's hard not to be a Muslim because the alternative is dead. So yeah, I don't know the history of that either, Glenn.
Well, I can tell you real quickly, the slave trade in Africa began from Islam. I mean, they were the original slave traders.
That's correct.
That came into Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa. So that's why there were so many that were Islamic.
Yeah, one of the things about this article, I don't know if you guys caught this or not, but it hit me kind of weird. There was a little bit of a prophetic piece in here. Did you notice it? They're all shaking their heads at me.
Depends on what it is.
Tell us, Doc, great prophet. What was it?
Give me a clue.
What I noticed was if you think about what's going on right now with black and white relations in this country, the idea that the reason that Muslims are in the U.S. or were in the U.S. historically was because we brought them here against their will. That sounds to me like a pretty good argument for the Muslim faith to further cement a relationship with an angry African American constituency. Did you catch that?
No.
To me, it was a little bit scary because I could see where an argument could be made. I could see where Islam on the ground in the States could make an argument that African Americans were brought here against their will when they were Muslims in the first place. It was just a little bit nerving to me.
Yeah, when in fact Islam among African Americans started much later.
It did start much later as a thing here, if you will. But you can see where that could be a really powerful argument with a growing Islamic community here.
Again, not having read her book, but I wonder, Carl and others, just what was her perspective on Jefferson's own battle with the Barnaby Pirates? I mean, which took place during his presidency, and that was one of the first battles really against
Tripoli.
Muslims.
That's right. Halls of Tripoli.
But did anybody at that point were these things? Did they appear as? Right now, these things are in a context where we're looking at them as religious wars. I don't really think the Barbary Pirates were considered we weren't fighting a religion against a religion. Is that a fair statement, or have I missed the historicity of all that?
Oh no, it was well known. This was Islamic. This was Muslim.
No, I understand that, but did we view it in that same lens as we do now, as one religion?
Well, we may not now, but
a holy war. Thank you.
Yeah, back then I think they probably would have because they just didn't have the politically correct stuff that's floating around now to kind of dilute it. But it's fascinating that England had already gone through this argument with slavery, Islam. They were already beginning that process before the colony. We were just a colony, another colony, and then with Jefferson and everyone else. So a lot of what was going on in the political atmosphere between England and the American colony and all of that had already, the roots of it was coming out of what was going on in the beginning of the end of the slave trade, British slave trade, and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
But you're more of a historian than I am. So tell me, was it viewed then as a
I'll give you a quote. This is out of from Wikipedia. It says, in 1786, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams went to London to negotiate with Tripoli's envoy, and when they inquired concerning the ground, this is a quote, the ground of pretensions to make war upon nations had done them no injury, the ambassador replied, it was written in their Koran that all nations which had not acknowledged the prophet were sinners, whom it was the right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave.
Okay, so that hasn't changed.
So no, that hasn't really changed.
That hasn't changed
because we haven't paid much attention necessarily to that statement, but it hasn't changed the history.
And she's talking about pre-revolution, and then what we're talking about now is post-revolution.
Post-revolution, and also Jefferson may have had a different opinion back from.
He became the Secretary of War. He did.
Yeah. We'll have more to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Hey, and welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And joining me today, I'm Ben Ball, by the way, and joining me today is Bishop Doc Loomis, Reverend Carl Zorowski, and Reverend Robert Cornegie, as we talk about a little bit of a dust-up that took place in Buckingham Palace. This is from the Gospel Herald and gospelherald.com. And an article that is entitled, Queen's Chaplain Steps Down, Calls Reading of Quran in Church Service a Fairly Serious Error. It seems very British to say that way, doesn't it? One of the chaplains to the Queen resigned following his criticism of the reading of the Quran during a church service held at St. Mary's Episcopal in Glasgow earlier this month. The Reverend Gavin Ashenden, is that right? In a blog published on his website, explained that he needed to resign from his post, which he'd held for 9 years, to avoid any misunderstanding that his statements against what took place in the service were released on behalf of the Queen. As one of 33 chaplains to the Queen, his actions could be misinterpreted as representing the monarchy, and choosing to vacate his post, he would be able to speak freely on behalf of the faith, he said. If I did choose to speak out as a matter of integrity and responsibility, I ought not to do it while I was in the possession of the office of chaplain to the Queen. Doc, Bishop Loomis, is this a big deal?
It's a big deal on its face, it's even a big deal. Queen's chaplain, honorary position, 32 of them appointed. One the Queen appoints, the rest are brought to her by the clergy. Queen's chaplain is a little bit like a Monsignor in the Catholic Church, but it's actually more than that. It's somebody who has done has really profoundly influenced the church in positive ways, and at the same time, they're usually very patriotic people, very supportive of the crown.
It is the Church of England, after all.
It is, and I love the terms in the Church of England. There's all these terms like constabulary and what is, I'm trying to remember, the man that runs the chaplaincy is like the chaplain of the closet. That's so awesome. But the challenge with what's going on in England right now, as you probably read, that there is obviously there's a real move toward heterodoxy in the church on a lot of levels. And the challenge is that the GAFCON primates, the Global Anglican Future Conference primates, who are the global South primates, who consider themselves to be Orthodox Anglicans, have actually, they are consecrating and sending to England a bishop that will be in England and Scotland for now, so that people who are of an Orthodox tradition, Anglican-wise, can have some kind of oversight that's not the Church of England. All that is to say that the Anglican Church for some time has been in a bit of a crisis with people stepping in and out of communion with one another. And every time in England somebody steps up to point that out or to say something, significantly, scriptural, then they get whacked down. And what this man said, good grief. A man got up at a cathedral church on Epiphany and read from the Koran a section that really speaks about the fact that Allah is God and Jesus really isn't. And called this, let's have a war between Jesus and Muhammad. And so all this guy said was that was a really bad idea. But because he said it, and because he's one of the Queen's honorary chaplains, then it could be taken that it would be like Ari Spicer getting up and saying something on his own. And when the crown came back to him, and when the church came back to him and kind of pushed, he said, well, then I'd rather step down than not be able to speak what is true. And the best line this guy had, he said he has done this in the past, and his line in one of his past rants was, why should I be disciplined for protecting the faith as the chaplain representative of the woman who is by title the protector of the faith? Mm-hmm. I thought that was great. And that's what he's doing. He's protecting the faith and got smacked down.
During the service, passages from the Quran, this is from the article, saying Jesus was not the Son of God, were read in Arabic, causing many Christians to feel offended that this was allowed at a church service, particularly one that was meant to celebrate the wise men's visit to Jesus when he was a child, an acknowledgement of him being God in human form. This is, Carl, this is a difficulty I think a lot of churches are struggling with, is that do they look at and recognize scriptural passages or put it this way, holy passages from other religions? Do they look at them and say, this is something we can draw from? This is completely antithetical to it, but it's but it is part of that controversy.
Right. And I think part of the problem, Ben, too, is that the people in our pews aren't familiar enough with what is in the Scripture to recognize whether what they're hearing comes from the Scripture or not. Exactly I think that we have a real problem with biblical illiteracy in the church today. And how can we defend the faith if we don't know what the faith says? Okay, how can we protect the faith from attack if we don't recognize the attack when it's coming? I've got a lot of admiration for this chaplain here. For saying, yes, I'm a chaplain to the Queen. I would think that would be a great thing to have on your resume, chaplain to the Queen. But he said, it's more important to me to defend my faith than to hang on to this little certificate that puts me in this position of honor.
Robert, to Carl's point about Bible illiteracy on our part, I think he's right. I think a lot of people, you could read things from Hindu or Confucius or, the Lord helps those who help themselves, and people are going to think that's in the Bible.
What? It's not?
I believe that's in Psalm 154.
154, yes. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's so popular. You just take it that, I know it. Isn't it sad that it's come to that point? You can't give what you ain't got.
Is that in there too?
That's Jesus said that somewhere. I'm not quite sure where. But
I think it's you can't always get what you want.
Oh, is that the way it was? And that was Mick. But look, it's so true. Here is a defender of the faith, and he's having to leave his position to be able to defend his faith. Yeah. Within the church. It is phenomenal to me. That's
who is tasked with defending the faith. That's the irony of it. Right? Yes,
the purity of the faith. And so look, when the bedrock gets that weak, when the foundation is not based on the cornerstone of Christ anymore, It's based on public opinion and being nice. And as we've been talking about, coexisting with these other and contrary positions, and we've got a real problem. That surah that was read was it was amazing.
Yeah.
It was picked specifically to be exactly the opposite of what the Epiphany is all about.
Right.
The worshiping of
I,
God.
I do have a question with this worship service. Was this like a formal reading as part of the service, that this was set aside and designated that this would be read?
It was during the readings.
During the
During the
readings. Okay.
readings, they brought in
the liturgy of the word,
imam.
right?
As a United Methodist minister, I am obligated to make sure that whatever is read or preached in the church to which I've been appointed, that it support the theology that we teach.
Yeah.
When you're, I don't know how you guys do it in the Methodism, but when you're an Anglican, the first promise you make in your ordination is to protect and defend the faith from strange and erroneous doctrine. That is the first promise that you're required to make. And so this man was being asked, this man was simply doing what he vowed before God at his ordination under the hand of a bishop to do. Everyone I've ever ordained has to make that promise. And the fact of the matter is, if I found out there was a priest of mine that didn't do that, I would take action against him. But in this case, the bishop actually stood with the reading.
Yes.
That's the challenge.
Yeah. And Ashton goes on to say in this article, says the problem with what happened in Glasgow was that although it was presented as a way of building bridges and a way of educating people, it was done badly and in the wrong way, in the wrong place, in the wrong context. He said it should not happen in the Holy Eucharist, and particularly a Eucharist whose main intention is to celebrate Christ, the Word made flesh, come into the world. I mean,
there are all kinds of opportunities that you could present within the church environment to explore other faiths, to bring in people to share what they believe.
Yeah, we call them potluck suppers.
But a worship service where we are worshiping the triune God, that's not the place to do it.
It is amazing, isn't it? Because when we gather together as a congregation, regardless of whatever label you put on it, we are bringing with us our worship. We don't go there to get worship. We bring our worship to that place to share together in one voice, adoration, worship, thanksgiving, praise, all that to God. And so to have this, a negotiation with it's just mind-boggling that this would have any kind of pushback whatsoever. It's just astounding, really, how far the church has slipped off its foundation.
But also, who did not see this coming, that this would be an issue?
The one that was asleep at the sheep gate. That's the point.
Right.
We're supposed to be guarding that sheep gate as clergy in the church. And this is a guy who basically said at the cathedral, he said, look, guys, I'm going to be bringing a wolf in. I'd just like you to look at him, listen to him a little while ago. Who does that?
Right.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Thank you.
The wolf in the sheep's
Woof.
Woof.
Yes.
Woofy.
More to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the talk station, FM 107 and AM 1240. I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Robert Cornegy, Reverend Carl Zarowski, and Bishop Doc Loomis. And our next article that we talk about today comes from the website churchmilitant.com. And it says, the headline is, Cities that reduced safe sex programs saw sharp drop in teen pregnancies. This is out of London. Funding cuts to so-called safe sex programs in the United Kingdom have been linked to historic lows in teen pregnancy rates, according to a recent study published in the latest volume of Journal of Health Economics. The teenage pregnancy strategy, initiated in the United Kingdom in 1999, featured safe-sex classes and distribution of birth control to teenagers. This was an effort to curb teen pregnancy rates, which were twice that of the rest of Europe at the time. After the global economic crisis of 2008, cities in the United Kingdom began to enact cuts to sex education programs. The new research focuses on the impact of these cuts on teen pregnancy in 149 British cities, and the study found that the surge in spending on birth control and sex education programs between 1999 and 2005 did little to change an already declining teen pregnancy abortion rate. Steep cuts enacted in 2008, however, show a strong correlation with likewise steep drops in teen pregnancies and abortions. This is a field I know that you work in, Robert, and this is sounds counterintuitive to popular thinking, to the worldview. Right?
Yeah, it's kind of like, hello, if you tell people just go do it and be careful,
but be safe,
then they're not gonna do it, right? They're just gonna say, oh no, I'm not gonna do it. No. It actually normalizes. That's what all this safe sex stuff. They don't even use those terms anymore.
Right.
You know, it's all about the whole idea that shifted in the late 90s was to shift from abstinence, or risk avoidance is the term we use now, to risk reduction. So two different things: risk avoidance, sexual risk avoidance, sexual risk reduction. Two different strategies. Abstinence is risk avoidance. You just don't go there. You encourage people to wait and to not participate in this process, and had incredible results. Here in our county, that we saw amazing results when the lifeguard program through the pregnancy center got into the public school system, and we saw our percentages dropping of teen pregnancy. It was incredible. And now, unfortunately, with a change of leadership, we are seeing us move towards a risk reduction model in our county. And this kind of article, coming from the UK of all places, is reinforcing what we've known all along. If you tell them not to do it, if you make it the normal is to wait, is to avoid sexual activity, rather than just go ahead and, we know you're going to do it, just be sure to whatever,
right?
Take some kind of precaution. Well, number one, we've discovered that they really don't take the precautions, and they've been given the green light to be sexually active.
In other words, they saw the green light, they didn't read the warning label.
No, of course not. That's right.
Right. Carl, again, this is, I think, also is this argument about what respecting life. I mean, they're so often the programs that are out there now kind of phrase everything in terms of this is a bad thing to happen when you get pregnant, instead of being a good thing when it's the right time.
Right. And I'm listening to what you're saying. I'm listening to what Robert's saying, and I wonder if you don't have some sense of morality being taught to the children, then sex is just something else that you do.
It's an activity.
Okay. And parents, I don't think that parents are having the proper conversations with their children about sex. I just got a thumbs up from Doc over here on that. And I'm a father of 2 young girls. Right? And we're at the age now that we're starting to have those conversations. Are they easy to have? No. But what I think they need to be taught, and we as Christian leaders need to teach this, is that sex is not a bad thing. Sex is a wonderful thing that God has given us as a gift to be celebrated within the covenant of a marriage.
All right, Doc, this is, again, coming out of the UK for this. It's a study. It's interesting. It's in the Journal of Health Economics. And a lot of people have often put abortion in economic terms. And here we are talking about how teenage pregnancies have been reduced as an economic side benefit to a depression or a recession area of 2008. I think that's kind of has an interesting twist to it.
Well, there's plenty of journals that will look at this objectively and write about it, and there are theologians that will talk about it. This is one place it ended up because it does, in fact, have an economic impact. But the thing, I'm back with Robert in the beginning of this. What you've said, Robert, is right on, and you've been doing this a long time, so you know. But the idea of saying, look, we know you're going to speed, but if you would speed between 2 and 4 a.m. when our police are off duty, we would really appreciate it, just isn't helpful. No. There's nothing helpful about that kind of a direction. And I'm encouraged to know that when we stop handing people condoms and telling them to have sex, that they actually don't do it as often. But I also love what Carl said. I'm agreeing with both of you today. I love what Carl said. The reality is, if we don't start with some moral underpinnings, if we don't share with our children about the Christian view of sex and the way that God created us and the interest that he has in us having mutual joy and all that, but within the bonds of the marriage, then we make a mistake. And Carl, we talk about this all the time on this show. Because it's hard when we have these conversations. I mean, who goes home from here and says, yeah, I'm doing a good enough job? I mean, I really want to go back to the pulpit. I want to go back to the people that I talk to and that I counsel with and say, I want to go back to my children and say, man, I wish I had done a better job of communicating to you the beauty of sex and marriage. And I mean, my wife and I celebrated 35 years yesterday, and we were sitting at a restaurant. I was just looking at her going, this is amazing. And these kids are missing this. They're running from house to house and bed to bed and needle to needle, and this is their life. And I'm sitting there with this woman who for 35 years has loved me. How do I communicate to the church the beauty of that?
Right.
And how do I understand it? We do this in the marriage vows. We say this all the time, that that marriage is a symbol of Christ's relationship with his church, and we've just that's just kind of fallen off somewhere in a cool breeze.
And who do you want teaching this to your children? Do you want to teach it to your children, or do you want to trust somebody else to do it?
Well, that's the big question right now here in our local community as well. That's why in North Carolina we have 100 counties, and every county has at least one school district, at least one school board at any rate. And that school board is responsible to reflect the values and the understanding of the community, the parents, and what their perspectives are and what they believe is the best way that their kids should be educated. And Carteret County has been very coordinated in this. We've had a lot of input, but we're seeing a real challenge now as some federal funds from the last administration. Everything's on a delay. So, we're seeing about a half a decade delay in some of this stuff. So we're 5 to 10 years shift. And so we're seeing now coming into our county funds from previous administrations that have pushed this risk reduction agenda, and we're trying to get it back to where it is. And there is cooperation. We've had a change in leadership. We're hoping that that's going to be reflected in the whole sex ed program. But you're right. We really do need to make sure that the school system sex education program is teaching the values of the parents.
Right, the values, because all we're teaching, all I think the kids are learning right now, and I look back to when I had it back many years ago from a 7th grade gym teacher.
Yeah.
We learned the mechanics.
Correct.
Okay, and that's what they're learning now. They're learning the mechanics. You do this, this can happen. You do this, it won't happen. Instead, we should be teaching them, God gave us this for this reason, and a beautiful thing can happen when it is done properly.
Mm-hmm. And to go on Carl's point and yours, Robert, the lifeguard program, we always thought of it as much as a character development issue.
Well, that was the emphasis.
Right.
It was making sound decisions,
Right.
life decisions, being able to have provide them with the tools to be able to make good decisions, the consequences, and that's what teens are so poor at is figuring out that there are consequences for my behavior.
And the fact that Ben mentions that it had to do with character development, that brings in the moral piece.
That's
of the puzzle.
Right. Yeah. And Doc, again, if you've often talked before about it, well, we have a problem in the pulpit. We have a problem about addressing these issues as well in the church, and that we need to be more upfront about that.
Absolutely. I mean, just honoring marriage in front of the church is such an important thing. When I was a kid, marriage was a real big deal. We honor. I mean, every anniversary, every good thing that happened.
Yeah.
We honored, and it's pretty rare anymore in the church that marriage gets a good boost, and it's hard because there's so much divorce, there's so much infidelity. It's just, gosh, we feel like we're going to make people feel bad if we talk about 35 years or 50 years of marriage. Well, what about all those people? I actually had somebody say to me, we were going to honor a 50-year couple, and somebody actually said to me, well, what about all those people who, on their second and third marriage, won't they feel bad? And I thought, well, golly, I don't know. But it's important for all of us, whether we've been married once or twice, it's important for us to have the sanctity and the beauty of marriage held up in front of us from time to time, for heaven's sakes. And that's the pulpit job, man.
We'll have more to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. For our final segment, we're going to look at a state story from North Carolina. This is a story about the Guatemalan who's facing deportation and receiving sanctuary at a North Carolina Episcopal church. This is from the Episcopal News Service. An Episcopal church in North Carolina is sheltering a Guatemalan woman as she defies federal orders to leave the country after failing to receive a stay of her deportation. The Guatemalan woman, Juana Luez, I'm trying to say it, Tobar Ortega, first came to the United States in mid-1990s to escape violence in her home country, the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina said in a news release. In April, she was told by federal immigration authorities that she had until May 31st to return to Guatemala, potentially leaving behind her husband, who's an American citizen, and her 4 children, as well as her job of 8 years as a sewing machine operator, the diocese said. Working with a Quaker group called the American Friends Service Committee, St. Barnabas in Greensboro agreed to serve as a sanctuary church and take in Tobar Ortega while she fights deportation. Now, the article goes on to talk about how this church spent a year in discernment over whether or not to be a sanctuary church, and also a little bit about her case in that it became, at first she applied for, if I have this right, she applied for exile but was turned down, but was given an extended visa, and now that's run out. And so that's kind of the basic crux of it, if I understand that correctly.
Well, did it run out, or did she? It felt more like she had a daughter who was sick at home, and she illegally left the country.
Yeah, she went back to Guatemala in 1999.
And upon her return, her status was adjusted, I think is what happened. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
She first arrived in the United States.
If she'd done the law, if she'd stayed here, she might still have access.
Yeah, her initial request for asylum was denied, but she received a work permit and was allowed to stay for 6 years while she appealed the decision on asylum. She went back to Guatemala in 1999 to care for an ailing oldest daughter. When she returned, her work permit was revoked. She remained in the United States. In recent years, she's been checking in with federal authorities regularly while she sought a stay of removal. So 17 years have gone by since that revocation. But now this church is taking her in and her family as she fights that. What do you feel about that? I mean, after all, we do have sanctuaries. Is that their purpose?
We do. Well, a couple of things pop out to me in this article. One is that it says that she has been checking in with the authorities regularly. So it's not like she's trying to hide.
She wasn't hiding. Yes.
She's not trying to hide. She's trying to work things out. The other thing that struck me was that the church did not make their decision as a knee-jerk reaction. Mm-hmm. They spent a year in discernment over this. So what I see here are people not just responding or reacting, but actually, spending time and trying to figure out what is the best thing to do here.
And there's a third factor there, too. She was told by ICE to prepare for voluntary deportation. She wasn't given a date that she had to be out. She was given a date, but it was going to be on her own to deport. They weren't going to grab her to deport her. However, then she may be in violation of the law and subject to that later.
Now,
so
one
becomes
thing,
complicated.
One thing I don't understand is if somebody comes to our country seeking asylum, is there a process through which they can become a citizen? Or once you say, I'm here seeking asylum, does that stop or close any doors towards you going through a regular naturalization process? I don't know that.
Well, I think that and inferred this in the article, that if she had been approved for asylum, there would have been a path at that point with her staying here and not having to return. Because returning would be dangerous.
Correct.
So I think that is the case where when someone has and there are requirements to prove that you are in danger if you return home, but she obviously did return home, so that kind of thwarted the argument that she had.
Yeah, it's fascinating reading some of the letters after the comments after that, and one person took the time to go through. And I'm assuming they know what they're talking about, the due process in this. There is a process. And she had 6 years. She was given a visa for 6 years, a work visa, to work through that because she appealed her rejection. And look, Guatemala back then in the 90s was not a nice place to live.
No.
It was really rough. There were death squads. There were all kinds of stuff going on.
We have a Guatemalan family that moved in that time period.
Yeah. So the immigration folks at that time there were a lot of Guatemalans coming here then. So for her to have not been approved, it raises more questions than answers,
right,
about why that happened. But she didn't follow the process from then on, and so she's caught in this legal.
Yeah, and part of that is if she was checking in with federal authorities regularly, and again that's on her word that was true. Then where was the liaison to say, well, you need to be in this line, not in that line, so. Is there a process? But let's look at the larger question. At what time does a church, when do they provide sanctuary to people who may be have committed an illegal act?
Have or have not.
When they, if they may have, may not have been adjudicated, but they have. They
right,
may have
right. She came in legally.
Yeah,
she came in. She was given a work visa for 6 years. So the
and she's given
offense was later.
Yeah, well, she's given an opportunity to appeal that rejection.
Exactly. So therefore, how does the church respond to that? And I agree that the church is to be a place where we fight for justice. Mm-hmm. What is justice in this situation? And under the laws of the land, how do we do that? And so the church has to, if it's going to take on this responsibility, which I think it should, then we need to be able to be a partner in that legal process of working through. And I'm assuming that's why it took them over a year to figure out what they were getting themselves into if they did this, because they're if you're aiding and abetting someone in criminal activity, there's a consequence to that too.
Well, and there's a clear difference between what they were discerning and what they did, as if someone who shot somebody and they ran down a street away from being chased and they run into a church and they're seeking sanctuary. That's a clear difference. Mm-hmm. Doc, would you agree there?
I think we all agree the church is doing the right thing. Is that right? I mean, this is a good thing.
As long as they're working towards
a resolution.
Legal resolution.
But I mean but it's how we do everything. The church, we're called to a level of discernment, and so if somebody runs through our doors who's just shot, a nice lady on the street out, we would have a different response. But this really does seem to be somebody who's stuck in a bureaucratic nightmare. I mean, I can't even imagine what this gal is going through. You know, your daughter is dying in another country, and you go there and you technically break the law, but you've done everything right, and you're going to visit with ICE, and you're doing, oh, you've got a job, you're not living off the government. You're doing everything we want an immigrant refugee to do.
Right.
And so at that point, that verse about, taking care of the alien in our midst really makes sense. And I love that the church is doing this. I think it's wonderful. The nice thing is they've partnered with the Quakers, who have been doing this forever. I mean, they've got an entire system in place, which the diocese and the church did not. And they know what the limits of the law, what the limits are. They have lawyers that do this. And so bravo for these guys. Bravo. It's wonderful.
I think the challenge will be for this church is in their discernment is what is the one who is maybe not quite as legitimate in their path that they followed as she has been.
That's tough discernment. You have to draw lines.
Yeah, that's right.
And churches are notoriously bad at drawing lines.
And
ours are squiggles.
As far as am I in agreement with what the church has done? I guess it all depends on their motivation. If they are doing this out of a love for the woman and a concern for her well-being, then yeah, they're doing the right thing. But if they're doing this to buck the system and to make a statement against the government or make a statement against immigration laws, then I'm not sure they're doing the right thing. Yeah. But with a year of discernment,
obviously that came up.
I believe that, and I'm sure it did. But I feel this church is doing the right thing. I hope my church would do this.
Well, it's important also to note that these are immigration laws that have been on the books a long time. Mm-hmm. None of this stuff is recent. This has been happening for a long time. She's been in this pickle for decades now. And so, if you try to make some political hay off of it, then, you're barking up the wrong tree.
Well, what about, though, I thought that the church needs to have an end game in mind. They need to know when have we done all that we can do here?
That's a very good point, Ben.
And I think that's going to be difficult down the road, and unless there's a political settlement somewhere that steps in, does that. So we'll see how that works out. Thanks for joining us today on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of the Talk Station.